I'm one of Charlie Fanning's graduate students a long time ago, longer ago than people in this lecture remember, here at UNSL and also at SIU, I call it down there. As all his graduate students, I owe a tremendous amount to Charlie. In fact, before I met him, I didn't know what Irish studies was. I mean, I've heard Irish studies, but the hell didn't anybody talk about it. I had a lot of Irish behavior in my family, but I didn't realize it was actually stuff in me. So this was the career for me. So I took off from there, and I never looked back. So I owe him everything as his students do. We have a panel of three of his other graduate students here, and what we're going to do today is just kind of introduce you to his graduate students and have them tell you what they're doing. So we got to look at kind of what Charlie, she might say, his scholarly great-grandchildren are. Scholarly grandchildren, I guess. Scholarly grandchildren coming out. So we have, first of all, Eva White. She is a professor of English, and she's the chair of the English and Language Studies program at Indiana University-Kokomo. She is presenting on when Galicia met Ireland. Second is Karen Golightly, who I was terrified all morning that I was going to identify her as Holly Golightly. I aced it. Karen Golightly, she's the chair of Literature and Language at Grigsby Brothers University in Memphis. Her specialty is 19th century Irish folklore. She was actually Charlie Fanning's assistant to research assistant in Felton for 2007 at Cardinale. And finally, Jill Hampton, many of you know, she's an associate professor at the University of South Carolina-Aiken, where there are a lot of Irish because of all the equestrians there, Irish writing courses. Her specialty is 19th century Irish American women writers. She's also interested in studying what she calls the pedagogy of the sentence, the significance of the sentence. So I think she's going to talk about both of those here. So without any further ado, please welcome Eva until people will get started.
Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for being here to help us celebrate my illustrious mentor, Dr. Charlie Fanning. Okay, it does work. Okay. He has been a pivotal figure in my work and my life. He not only introduced me to Ireland and its diasporic identity, but also helped me discover my Galician roots. In the process, he has helped me reclaim an important part of myself. I met Charlie when I was a graduate student at SIU Carbondale. He was my first encounter with Irish studies, and through his classes, he opened up a new world for me. His book, The Exiles of Erin, was life-changing, as it gave me a historical yet very human lens through which to view the Irish diaspora. It also helped me understand my parents' own immigration experience. It made it real for me. Oops, I have to make sure I keep up with the slides. Okay. As the child of economic migrants from Galicia, Spain, to Switzerland, and an immigrant to the U.S. myself, I found many commonalities between the Irish and the Galician experiences of immigration. An unexpected encounter with Galicia at SIU Carbondale's library in the form of a memoir by a Galician woman named Carmen cemented my relationship with Irish studies. When it fell off a shelf near me while I was working on my thesis on Beckett, there was no going back. Charlie's support when I decided to go out on a limb and change my thesis to research the similar experiences of immigration between Ireland and Galicia was a great gift for me as a scholar and as a person. At a time when the connections between Galicia and Ireland were not well known, Charlie's encouragement changed how I viewed myself and my place in the world through my scholarship. As I state in the foreword to my book, A Case Study of Ireland and Galicia's Parallel Paths to Nationhood, a mouthful, my motivation to write this book was personal as well as scholarly. I'm a Galician raised in Switzerland who took conscience of her Celtic roots in the United States of America while pursuing a literary degree in Irish studies. This realization came to me when Charlie invited Brian Kelso-Crowe, a local Irish musician and the host of Celtic Connections, to our class. When Brian mentioned the Galician Celtic band Milladoiro, I raised my hand. At hearing that I was from Galicia, Brian boomed, "You're a Spanish Celt." In these few words, I was baptized into a new identity that I had never suspected. Charlie set me on my new path by encouraging me to research the literary and historical connections between the two Celtic lands. I found two nationalist movements in the 19th century, the Celtic Revival in Ireland and the Resurgimento in Spain, and their respective poets, Thomas More with his Irish melodies and Rosalía de Castro with her Cantares Gallego. After this, my fate was sealed. I was an Irish studies scholar. Charlie took me under his wing and introduced me to our famous ACIS conferences, where I began to present my first papers, The Four Mothers of the Dispossessed, Motherhood in Irish Melodies and Cantares Gallego, and Immigration as Emancipation, Portrayals of the Immigrant Irish Girl in 19th century fiction, and where I found a home and met many of you here today. Although my research might seem a bit eclectic at first, there is one common thread that ties it all together. I am constantly investigating issues of identity, hybridity, and displacement, both in my academic research and my creative writing. I also tie these issues to my own life in an effort to better understand my own blended identity. While I have published several pieces on these topics, my main focus has been Irish writer and playwright Roddy Doyle and his treatment of multicultural Ireland, which is still the larger part of my research today. My first article to include Doyle was From Emigration to Immigration, Irishness in the Irish Short Stories of Sarah Orne Jewett, and Roddy Doyle's The Deportees. It was a transition of sorts as I compared the Irish emigration to America in the 19th century to the 20th inward migration to Ireland. And let me see, do I give you some? Okay, I'll skip a little bit so we get to have lunch eventually. So, okay. With the Deportees, Doyle brings up the question, who's Irish? As a result of Ireland's Celtic Tiger brief economic boom, Ireland has experienced a parallel boom in terms of inward migration. This is new territory for Ireland, who has been challenged to answer the question, who is Irish? Roddy Doyle answers by chronicling Ireland's racial, cultural, and national identity migration, and by challenging redefining the concept of Irishness in his fiction. In the process, he also redefines a traditional relationship Ireland has had with the experience of immigration, now that the tables are turned and Ireland is playing the role of host country. Doyle thus reinvents Irish identity as an ongoing process of grafting and hybridization. A case in point is his collaboration with the immigrant community in Dublin and bringing Nigeria into the center of Irish culture and national life. Let me skip a little bit more. In particular, his work with Metro Iran, a weekly multicultural paper by immigrants for immigrants. Also, the collection of short stories, The Deportees, and also his collaboration with Nigerian-Irish playwright B.C. Adigun on the multicultural adaptation of James Synge's The Playboy of the Western World. Skip ahead a little bit more. So the new intercultural Irishman, the Roddy Doyle, and Nigerian Irish playwright B.C. Adigun promoting their multicultural adaptation of James Seng's The Playboy of the Western World, featuring a Nigerian refugee as Christie, while written in the same spirit of integration as the deportees, was seen by many as a post-racial utopia. Indeed, Doyle's collaboration with B.C. Adigun ended badly as they experienced the parting of the ways. Charlotte McIver assigns the failure of the collaboration to tensions between multiculturality, which is the disconnected and passive coexistence with ethnic minorities, to interculturalism, which is the active exchange between different cultures and ethnicities. So you have the slide right there, so I'll move on. In 2014, I interviewed Roddy Doyle about the end of his collaboration with B.C. Adigun. He expressed his disenchantment thus: "It's just horrible to have someone to consider a friend when things become a little bit complicated, immediately accuse me of racism and others as well. Unfortunately, things went terribly wrong in terms of both my personal and working relationship with BC, and ended up on the steps of the High Court. It went on for 6 years. A huge expense. I can't speak from his point of view. I can only speak from mine. But looking back, was it worth it? Was it worth going through all the grief that came later? No, it wasn't." For his part, B.C. Adigun was not ready to be interviewed then and declined my request for an interview, while stating elsewhere, "If someone had told me that Ireland is a place where a dramatist's carefully constructed castle of words could be commandeered, occupied, poked at, and deconstructed the moment his back is turned, I would have said, you're joking." However, that was what happened to the modern version of the Playboy, which I have paraded as the epitome of interculturalism at its best. But this is neither the time nor the space to go into the trauma and hardship which the huge success of the modern version of the Playboy has caused me. In April 2023, I was finally able to interview B.C. Adigun via Zoom with B.C. in Nigeria in the middle of a power failure, and me in Indiana, sunny Indiana. This followed the American premiere of the new Playboy in November 2022, which was staged by Solas Nua in Washington, D.C., where this organization dedicated exclusively to contemporary Irish arts is based. During the interview, B.C. discussed the play, his view of his collaboration with Doyle, why it ended in the courts, and whether he thought there was room for a reconciliation between them. I'm finishing a paper covering the new production and its meaning, which I presented as Ending the Curse of the New Playboy, Adigun and Doyle's American Path to Redemption, on November 2023 at ACIS Boston College. Here are a few highlights from the presentation. In his review of B.C. Adigun and Roddy Doyle's 2007 centennial adaptation of The Playboy, Peter Annie Nzekwe criticizes the play for its patricidal act and lack of redemptive power. In particular, he warns that such a play angers the African gods and that until Adigun and Doyle set Christopher towards that path of redemption and he redeems himself, he is under a curse that is of tragic consequence to him and to our world. 15 years later, after several lawsuits that resulted in the Abbey paying 600,000 euros in legal fees and settlement terms for copyright violation, Adigan, having given full ownership of the play, and the co-creators completely parting ways, Annie and Zekwe's words take on a new meaning. Enough so to consider how the warning that Christopher must have to appease the gods in order to redeem himself, his family, and his community is also applicable to Adigan and Doyle in terms of lifting the more important curse of alienation off the play by bringing new life and redemption to the defunct intercultural collaboration. Perhaps this path to redemption has begun in the liminal space created by the play's first 2022 American production. This third space allows for the play to be judged on its own merits, away from the politics of identity surrounding the Irish productions, in what Doyle calls lazy journalism and Adigan considers discriminatory. It might just clear a path to redeem the play, the co-authors' collaboration, and perhaps even their friendship. Doyle and Adigan parting of the ways was a shocking outcome, as Adigan at one point describes his cooperation with Doyle in writing the new version of the Playboy as the epitome of a genuine interculturalism in creative writing, and is similar to conceiving a child together. Now that Adigan is, as he says, the single mother of this, or the single father, as Roddy Doyle gave me custody, he doesn't want the baby that was taken from him in 2008 to go through this again. When asked if his relationship with Doyle is like the relationship between Christopher and Pegeen, he answers, "Yes, I think it is very much like that. The reason I'm back in Nigeria now was the outcome of the fallout. I would still be in Ireland with my family." Adigan is ready to reconnect with Doyle. He told me that though he realizes it will not be an easy thing, I'm open to reconciliation. I'm open to negotiation. BC is grateful to Rex Dougherty, the artistic director of Solas Nua, for being brave and bold for staging the play. Because, end quote, because of what happened, it seemed that the play had become untouchable. But now I hope that people will begin to see that it is touchable and that I'm not as bad as I was made to be by the legal industry, end of quote. The American production does seem to lift the curse by offering an impartial venue that allows the play to be judged for its own merits, away from the politics of identity surrounding the Irish productions. As such, it offers new life to the Playboy, as well as opens the way to a possible reconciliation between Adigan and Doyle, reuniting its parents and offering them a new home for their baby. This American production might just clear a path to redeem the play, the authors' collaboration, and perhaps even their friendship. Another project I'm working on is a memoir, Back to Galicia. In this too, Charlie inspired me after I read his memoir, Mapping Norwood. Once again, he has led me to rediscover parts of my identity, this time not through research, but through creative writing. So I get a bit emotional over here. Although I have written and published some memoir pieces, the first, also titled Back to Galicia, where I use a pseudonym, encouraged by the great Emmon Wall. Where are you, Emmon? Thank you. Who probably still doesn't know how much his support has meant to me. It was not until seeing Charlie's life in print and in a historical context, tying him to his Irish roots, that made me realize that bringing the disparate parts of myself into one book might heal the Galician girl in search of hers. Thank you, Charlie, for forging a path for me and many others to follow.
I know in your program it says that the title of my talk is Irish Folk and Fairy Tales, and that is what I did go to SIU to study, and studied it for a long time and wrote about it, and later on wrote about the relationship, well, particularly the translation and writing down and editing of the oral tradition of Irish Folk and Fairy Tales by the Anglo-Irish, and then later on Tana French's own incorporation of 19th century folklore into her own work. However, the real title of this talk is Try Not to Have a Pulmonary Embolism or a Baby While You're Getting Your PhD. So I know the purpose of this panel is about how Charles Fanning's research assistants has influenced my own research projects and teaching in Irish studies, and it certainly did. But I apologize in advance as I'm going to digress a bit from that. I mean, obviously, I was his research assistant from about 2004 to 2007, but what he did for me personally meant more than all of the many, many facts about Irish history and literature ever did. And those things meant a lot. But his grace and kindness as a teacher and mentor meant so much more. When I first met Dr. Fanning, I was visiting SIU to research the English department graduate program to see if I wanted to apply there to get my PhD. And I met with the chair of the English department and told him I wanted to get my PhD in children's literature. Clearly, I had not done one bit of research before that moment. And he told me that they, in fact, did not have a PhD in children's literature, and he dismissed me and sent me to Dr. Fanning. But instead of turning me away, Dr. Fanning told me about the Irish Studies program at SIU, and after I explained to him that I wanted to study children's literature and specifically folk and fairy tales, he lit up, telling me about the special collections at the library there, the exchange program with NUI, and all of the Irish Studies courses at SIU. And right there and then, he convinced me to study at SIU. And I worked with him and for him in a couple of different capacities. First, he was my professor, my advisor, my dissertation director, mentor, and I was his research assistant. The first class I took from him was a Robert Frost Yates class, and I had to miss the first week of class because I was in the hospital randomly with a pulmonary embolism, which is a longer story that I'm not going to get into. So I emailed him, and I didn't really know him except for that first meeting we'd had, but I emailed him. He was very sympathetic. He gave me the readings, and I read a ton of Robert Frost while waiting around in the Carbondale Memorial Hospital to get my blood clots sorted out. And as everyone had told me about this hospital, once you go in, you never come out. Which worried me a lot, because I was there for like 2 weeks. So every time a nurse or a doctor walked into my hospital during the 2 weeks I was there, they would say to me, you have no idea how lucky you are to be alive. Or they would say, just this morning, an SIU freshman girl dropped dead from a pulmonary embolism, and you have a serious condition and we cannot let you leave yet. Those 2 weeks felt like an eternity. And this was just my second semester at SIU, and I was worried about my work and my ability to excel there. And I was, after all, starting a bit late at 36 years old. So the day I returned to class, we reviewed Robert Frost's entire biography, ending in the cause of his death. Do you remember? Pulmonary embolism. Dr. Fanning looked at me right when he read that part, and of course I immediately burst into tears while he dismissed class. It happened again in another class later on when we discussed T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland, comparing it to Yeats's Leda and the Swan. But what he could not have possibly known at that time was that I was in an abusive relationship, which I was completely silent about, covering it up with the shame that pulled on me every day, and that I was pregnant. So when we discussed Philomel's tongue being cut out, I again cried in the middle of class. Despite my constant weeping in the classes that he taught, at the end of the next semester, Dr. Fanning asked me to be his research assistant, which included orienting our Irish exchange students and, of course, research projects and work for his courses. I tried to talk him out of it at first because I couldn't believe he would really want me to work for him even after I told him I was going to have a baby in about 3 months, but he did. And as a result, I met Sheila McCormick, who was our hilarious and smart exchange student from Galway, who I'm still friends with today. And in fact, she helped me a year later when I went to Ireland on my own exchange program with NIU. My son, Pip, was born on February 15th, 2005. And I returned to school a week later. Thank you, Kevin Detmar, for not letting present my project worth 45% of my grade before my due date. At any rate, Pip came with me to work in school more often than not. And on one glorious occasion, I was working in Dr. Fanning's office, and Pip, of course, if you're parents, you'll know this, had a blowout diaper. And I was changing him on the floor of Dr. Fanning's office when he walked in. I've never been so embarrassed in my life, but of course, Dr. Fanning handled it with grace, telling me about his own children and diapers and making me not feel like such a fool in that moment. Then there was the time that we were working on an unpublished James T. Farrell original manuscript that he was overseeing and editing for production, and I've forgotten the title. I'm so sorry. But he had sent it home with me. I have no idea why he would do that in the state that I was in, but he wanted me to make a copy of it and then to edit on that copy. And he trusted me with the only copy of this newly found manuscript that seemed a lot like the Holy Grail to me. And this was me, and I was barely existing on no sleep and Diet Coke with a newborn that was literally connected to my body at all times. So before I had a chance to make the photocopy, what with carrying around a baby to and from the university daily, he called me from Carbondale Memorial Hospital, which you remember, you're never going to leave, right? To tell me that he had an incident, and I believe I could have this wrong too, that he called it a little something with his heart, if I remember correctly, and that he wanted me to hold on to that Farrell original manuscript in case something happened to him. And I just about lost my mind. I vividly remember sitting at my desk, and the manuscript was on my right, and my newborn was laying in my desk drawer, which was open, while I nursed him and typed on my computer. And I told him, please don't die. I don't think I can handle that. And he chuckled like he always does, and he said he was not planning on that. Obviously, when he returned to school and I returned the manuscript to him, much to my relief, we continued to work on that project together. He also convinced me that tests were a natural part of any graduate course, which I disagreed wholeheartedly and completely freaked out over every time I had a test in the history of Ireland courses, and that yes, in fact, with 3 small children, I could complete a fellowship in Galway. That fellowship was one of the loneliest and most amazing journeys that I've ever made, and I was able to understand this she in a way that I never could have conceived. It bloomed before me, real as the imagination, on a very late night as I walked down a pitch-black road into town to the pub on Inishmore to get my father some Lucozade to rehydrate him from the food poisoning he had contracted that morning. The magic continued later that spring when Seamus Heaney cooed at my son Pip, who was on a pack on my back while waiting in line for a cup of tea at Corch. He's a wee thing, isn't he? Heaney said, and I just stood there with my mouth agape. Dr. Fanning did even more, of course, encouraging me to publish, to present at conferences, and helping me and many others to get funding to attend. He wrote me letters of recommendation, and he read so many versions of my dissertation on fairy and folk tales that I know he must have been sick of hearing about silkies and banshees and the puka. He didn't flinch when I told him that I had to drive 14 hours to and from Memphis to get my 2 older children every weekend, or that I had never even read Ulysses before graduate school. He nodded when I told him I had to finish my dissertation within 3 months after completing my coursework so that I could take a job I'd been offered in Memphis. And he just kept encouraging me to keep on working hard and reading as much as I could and writing about Irish folk and fairy tales in every single class I took. So that's the real reason I ever made it through grad school. When I had no voice, no courage, no confidence, Charles Fanning gave it to me with no hesitation, like honeycomb candy to a child. And without his patience, knowledge, encouragement, and constant support, I would not be the writer, the professor, the chair, the mentor, the person, and especially not the mother that I am today. And for that, I am eternally grateful.
Thank you for inviting me to speak, Eamon, and having the trust in me that I would come up with something worth listening to. I experienced many of the same things Karen did. there was a group of us that were Charlie's first graduate students. Ron Ebest was one, and Matt and me. And what we did was we rotated the research assistantships or going to Galway to set that up. So we, too, enjoyed that incredible experience of working with him. Now, okay, I'd like to begin my presentation with a quotation from Jim Rogers, taken from his 2019 interview with Charlie. Quote, "It would be hard to overstate the centrality of Charlie Fanning to the study of Irish American literature," end quote. Also, in 2019, the guest editor of a Melus special, New Directions in Irish American Literature, James Byrne writes that Charlie Fanning's scholarship, quote, "invites and authorizes some truly fascinating observations on the origin and continuing development of Irish American culture as a field of study." When Charlie took us to conferences, we were all scared a little bit, presenting on this literature that we had just been introduced to. And I was sitting at a table waiting to present, and a professor was sitting there, and he turned around and looked at Charlie, and he said, "I can't believe he's here." So it was just, for the first time, really, I realized who he was, because before that, he had just been a very kind mentor to me. Okay, more pertinent to this paper, I read over a dozen reviews of his first work being discussed here, and nearly all point to the emergence of a major American scholar. Charlie's work leaves me grateful and in awe of the prodigious scholarship he contributed to the foundation of Irish studies in the U.S. And he began this gift with the study of a character who makes us laugh at ourselves, at our pretensions, and at the world to nurture a sense of belonging and community. Scholarly giants must begin somewhere, and Charlie began with questions about a late 19th century Chicago journalist, Finley Peter Dunne, and his creation of a barkeep philosopher, Mr. Dooley. In his interview last night, Charlie recapped the story of how he discovered Dunne and the sparse, even scant collections of his Chicago sketches. The more he read of Dunne's work, always with the historian's literary eye, the more he knew that this body of work needed to be examined. In 1978, he published what he had discovered in a book titled Finley Peter Dunne and Mr. Dooley. The scrupulous, disciplined, painstaking research, think the blinding microfilm rolls mentioned last night, served as the foundation that would undergird all his scholarly work. Dunne's writing impressed him to the point that eventually Charlie named Finley Peter Dunne as, quote, the first Irish-American genius, because he was, quote, the one writer of his time to sustain a realistic perspective through a significant body of work, end quote. He went on to claim that Dunne was, quote, the pioneering realist whose chronicles of the common life of working-class immigrants constitute the coming of age of Irish-American fiction. At the time, Charlie considered Dunne's character, Mr. Martin Dooley, quote, the aging immigrant bartender, quote, as the center of his research. I noticed a curious collaboration between Charlie and Mr. Dooley. Charlie offers a tone of sympathy, admiration mixed with a shrewd dose of reality, a perceptive ear, heartfelt respect for an aging barkeep philosopher who, in turn, speaks in a rather wide brogue, uses a similar tone, bringing comfort to his clientele, even as he doses them in reality. Equally relevant, I believe, Charlie and Martin share a purpose, Martin Dooley. He has suggested many times that Irish-American studies, especially in terms of immigrant literature and history, is a field overflowing with a cacophony of voices grieving over shared losses, celebrating shared joys, recounting shared history. Mr. Dooley is one voice in that melee, and Charlie lets him loose often in his pages to speak for himself and speak up for the working-class Chicago Irish America. Charlie's research offers a different, if not richer and fuller, Mr. Dooley to us. Some scholarly books have prose so turgid and dry and twisted with inverted clauses, passive voice linked together by multiple relative clauses, so numerous that the central idea is lost to its potential readers. Charlie's prose is gorgeous, filled with vibrant verbs, dynamic, at times, other times soothing, rhythmic, rolling sentences peppered with details just enough to let the mind absorb and retain, rather than overwhelm and confuse. Charlie toasts Mr. Dooley, who believed in the ideal of, quote, the common man as hero, a hero vested in the, quote, slow-thinking mill worker, quote, police sergeant, political kingmaker, alderman, parish priest, and we could continue. Charlie describes the bar as most Irish-American saloons of the time, quote, a community institution dispensing solace and companionship to a stable clientele of Irish mill workers, draymen, and streetcar workers. Charlie considered the pub regulars, the working-class characters, as imbued with, quote, dignity, heroism, and tragedy. In the early pages of his book, Charlie states, however, quote, there is no forced preaching here. The juxtaposition of the two situations does all the work. This is a favorite technique of Dunn's, Peter Dunn, who created Mr. Dooley, and many of the Dooley pieces depend on just such an understatement. Charlie was discussing Dunn's writing, an article or editorial about an issue in the same edition where Mr. Dooley would speak on it too. He felt that that was what made the sketches even more significant and compelling. I would argue that Charlie and his subject, Mr. Dooley, also share a juxtaposition of two voices. The scholar and the character become, in some ways, extensions of each other. Charlie gives voice to him within the context of scholarship. Yet scholarship is acquired knowledge with the intention and responsibility to share. With his extraordinary research and scholarship, Charlie has done just that. He has given us Mr. Dooley more than Dunn himself accomplished in the Chicago years. To me, one of the most important aspects of the study, however, mediates the inevitable tension between the scholar and the topic studied. Charlie provides the cultural context without silencing or subverting Martin Dooley's own voice. In The Irish Voice of America, Charlie once again alludes to the subtext of empathetic kindness Mr. Dooley extended to his pub clientele, despite his cynicism couched in satire. He writes, quote, Dunn's is an intelligent perspective on the price of assimilation in human terms, delivered with respect and compassion for all who were affected by turbulent social changes in late 19th century Irish America. No one had done it before, and no one has done it better. At the end of the introduction and the very last sentence, Charlie writes, quote, the following chapters are an attempt to reconstruct that creation. Chicago Mr. Dooley pieces, quote, the imaginative evocation of Bridgeport in the 1890s. In an amusing, perhaps prescient description of the Bridgeport of old, Mr. Dooley's stomping grounds, the Chicago Tribune published this description fairly recently. If Bridgeport were an old woman, she would be everyone's grandmother. Think of her as Bridgeport, the babushka, with lots of stories to tell, though she no longer speaks as loudly as she used to, and perhaps is no longer listened to as carefully. This book is one of those I wish I had read at the beginning of my career, because it informed so much of what I read afterwards. Charlie extends the same sympathy to Mr. Dooley as Mr. Dooley extended to his patrons. Over 40 years later, his words still ring true, especially in our current world. Perhaps everyone, not just scholars and students, need to be reminded of what immigrants brought into this country. Finally, as Alice McDermott put it so eloquently, get to the point, then quit. But please, Alice, I need to say one more thing. I came to this conference to honor Charlie, a brilliant scholar, an incomparable mentor, a pretty good soccer dad, and most of all, beyond any of those accolades, a priceless friend who, with his wife, Fran, stood by me and supported me through a difficult time, waiting for me to come back to my work, holding aloft a lantern, glowing in his outstretched hand, a hand that made a difference in my life. In South Carolina, we do a toast at graduation. Empty glass, obviously, and we raise it. Here's South Carolina toast to you, Charlie. May God bless you and keep you in the palm of his hand.